He stood on the iron wall at the hour when the sun forgets its warmth. Not sunset. There is no softness in a world that has been at war for 8 centuries, but the bruised copper light that slants low and turns every rivet into a dull ember. Below the parapet, the stones sweated cold, and the wind carried the breath of the trenches, wet earth, old smoke, cordite, and the sour metal tang of blood that has soaked too long into clay. The man's name did not matter. On the wall, names were sand. He was a registrar of the House of Wisdom by training and an eyewitness by misfortune, sent north to catalogue a battery line and caught by nightfall in a listening post where the faithful and the fallen traded prayers and artillery-like curses. He watched the Idzeb sharpshooters, lean silhouettes wrapped in cloak and scarf, shift their weight in practiced stillness, rifles cradled as if the wood might bruise, their eyes fixed on the far darkness where no lantern dared burn. Above them, ironwork and crenellation ran away into haze, a horizon of fortification so vast the mind refused to hold it. The wall was not merely a bulwark. It was a fact of creation as unquestionable as gravity, and yet he knew, as every learned soul knew, that it had not always been there. To understand the Sultanate, he always began where the world broke, not where the wall rose. In the year 1099, Jerusalem was taken in the First Crusade, and in the hour of triumph, a heretical band of Templars committed what later chroniclers would name the act of ultimate heresy, opening a gate to hell and destroying the city in the catastrophe that followed. That wound never closed. The Levant became a throat of ash and screaming wind where the inferno pressed against the skin of earth. And the war that followed was not like any war that had ever stained human hands. It was metaphysical, a siege between heaven's faithful and hell's fallen, fought with rifles and relics, trench clubs and unholy blades, prayers and poison gas, faith and infection. Over the centuries, the front calcified into trenches and blasted no man's land, a scar banded with wire and crater lakes that reflected a sky too often the colour of old brass. By the year of our Lord 1914, the Great War still raged, not as a campaign with an end, but as a condition of life. War as weather, war as law, war as inheritance. In those first years after the gate opened, the old powers of the world buckled. The timeline scholars kept, that dry chain of dates and calamities, spoke of the year of 3 battles and of the swift conquest of much of the Levant by heretics reinforced by the armies of hell's circles, and of Antioch being fortified into a focal point of resistance. But dry dates never captured what the registrar imagined when he read the earliest accounts. The smell of a burned city after a demon weapon has done its work, the way prayer sounds when it is shouted by men who can see the impossible on the far ridge, the way a child learns silence because the wrong noise brings winged things down from smoke. In those years, to be faithful was to be hunted, and to be Muslim in the lands near the breach was to be caught between the devouring swarm and the desperate retreat with the sea behind and the inferno ahead. The fallen did not merely conquer ground, they ate meaning, perverting language until oaths tasted like bile. The registrar had handled manuscripts that spoke of whole caravans vanishing into dust storms that moved against the wind, and of saints' bones turning black in their reliquaries. He did not know which accounts were literal and which were the exaggerations of trauma. In Trench Crusade, that boundary was thin as paper. Then, 1109, written cleanly in the annals, the great sultanate of the invincible iron wall, of the 2 horns that pierced the sky was formed, unifying Islamic factions that might otherwise have been shattered into rival banners. The registrar always lingered on that name. It sounded like a boast until you stood on the wall and understood that boasting required imagination, and the wall exceeded imagination. The law held that the Creator came to the aid of the believers, and that the great iron wall of Dhu al-Qarnayn manifested in the lands ruled by the Sultan of Rum, a scripture-made fortification reborn into iron and stone to bar Gog and Magog, names that, in this age, were spoken with a soldier's specificity rather than a theologian's distance. The wall's re-emergence changed everything. It did not end the war. Nothing ends the war. But it created a place where a civilization could survive intact, where workshops could keep their lathes running, where children could be born without immediately learning the sound of a demon's laugh. It also created a culture shaped around defense, a state whose heartbeat was measured in century rotations, garrison tallies, and the slow, patient mathematics of artillery arcs. Life under the wall was not soft, and anyone who told you otherwise had never seen how a society hardens when every generation is raised with the knowledge that beyond the northern and eastern marches, the world is desolate and predatory. The registrar had walked through armories where racks of rifles sat beside sealed crates of alchemical reagents, the air sharp with oils and resin, and through prayer halls where the faithful pressed foreheads to cool stone until the skin of their brows shone raw. The wall itself was a continent-long argument, a mighty bulwark festooned with artillery, with garrisons commanded by lords of standards, with watchfires and signal lamps hooded against distant eyes. Its shadow dictated trade routes, pilgrim roads, and the placement of cities that crouched like children behind a father's cloak. It also dictated the Sultanate's method of war: countercharge, sortie, raid, and measured retaliation. If the church in New Antioch was a spear point angled into the heretic domains, the Sultanate was the shield that refused to crack, and it learned to strike not with frenzy, but with endurance. The Janissaries embodied that endurance, and the registrar, who had once thought of them as mere symbols on recruitment ledgers, learned, watching them drill on the wall's wide platforms, that they were crafted as carefully as any alchemical device. They were raised from childhood in the arts of war, subjected to rigorous training and indoctrination, and many were taken during raids upon the harsh marches beyond the iron wall, seized from the margins where heretic influence festered, and survival was already a kind of brutality. On the battlefield they excelled at devastating countercharges and the crushing of enemy elites, and they served as bodyguards for the highest of the Sultanate's leadership. Their armor had a particular sound, not the clatter of cheap plate, but the deep, confident note of well-fitted metal over padded layers, every buckle and scale made to endure mud and shrapnel. When they moved, they did not hurry. They advanced with the implacable rhythm of a gate closing. The registrar once saw a janissary pause to touch his forehead to the muzzle of his rifle before a night sortie, a gesture so small it could have been superstition, except superstition has no place in a world where blessings and curses are demonstrably real. Trenchcompanion.com. And then there was the House of Wisdom, his house, where the war became intellect, and intellect became weapon. In other worlds, scholars argue about theories until the ink runs dry. In this one, theory either saves lives or kills its maker. The house regulated alchemy, trained new practitioners through trials that broke the careless, and dispatched expeditions beyond safe borders in search of materials and knowledge not found within the wall's protection. The registrar had seen Jairian alchemists in the field, faces masked not only against gas but against the intimacy of what they were about to do, muttering formulae over vials that steamed with colors no natural fire produced, Their creations were feats and warnings in equal measure, artificial beings with strength and vitality that could tear a man apart, lions wrought by craft and faith, and the infamous brazen bulls, monstrous engines of muscle and plated hide, equipped with weapons so heavy even janissaries could not lift them. When the bulls advanced, the ground seemed to accept them unwillingly, mud shivering under their weight, and the air filled with the stink of hot metal and animal breath. The registrar's pen had recorded their names, their costs, their battlefield roles. His body remembered the way men instinctively stepped back, not out of fear of death, but out of a deeper fear that the boundary between the created and the ordained was being tested in front of their eyes. That boundary was where the Sultanate's virtue and danger lived together, inseparable as oil and smoke. The faithful in this age do not only fight hell, they fight the temptation to become hell in the methods they adopt to survive it. The registrar had heard soldiers speak with awe of assassins from Alamut, Fidai bound by ancient pact to serve the Sultanate, slipping through the war's chaos to remove targets that could not be met honorably on open ground. Their cloaks were rumored to drink moonlight. Their rituals to bend time at the edge of perception. He could not confirm the rumors, only the outcomes. A heretic commander found dead behind his own line. An artillery spotter who vanished from a dugout that had only one door and was watched all night. Such tools were necessary, the veterans said. Necessary is a word that grows fat in wartime, swallowing scruples one by one. Even so, the Sultanate kept a stern kind of internal discipline. Merit and service valued because complacency is a luxury the war cannot afford. Across centuries, the war wrote new chapters in blood. The registrar's favourite, and most haunting, was a note from the broader faithful archives. The ancient city of Antioch, destroyed by a mysterious demonic weapon in 1545, and yet rebuilt, and yet still held as a bulwark at the edge of the gate's shadow. Such details mattered because they proved something vital. The faithful could be shattered and still refuse to end. The Sultanate story, braided with that endurance, sometimes allied in necessity, sometimes separated by distance and doctrine, but always bound by the simple truth that hell's victory would be everyone's extinction. In 1914, war bands of many factions moved through no man's land on missions that would look small on a strategic map, but enormous to the men living them. Raids to gather intelligence, recover relics, assassinate targets, capture prisoners, steal supplies, map enemy trenches. A skirmish could decide whether an artillery battery survived the week, whether a breach in wire held long enough for a countercharge, whether an alchemist retrieved a reagent that could keep a frontline clinic stocked with antiseptic, ordinary needs transfigured by horror. On the night the registrar stood watch, the fallen tested the wall with the kind of probing violence that never sought victory, only weakness. A flare went up over the distant mire, staining clouds an unhealthy white. For a heartbeat, the land looked like a corpse laid open. Trenches like ribs, crater ponds like dark eyes, wire snarls like exposed sinew. The Azib held their breath, and somewhere, a janissary captain, one of the Yuzbashi the registrar had seen in rosters, made a hand signal that passed down the line like a silent prayer. Far below, a gun crew worked by touch, loading a great cannon whose barrel was cold enough to mist in the air, and when it fired, the sound rolled along the wall, not as a crack, but as a deep, organ note thunder that shook dust from mortar joints and made the registrar's teeth ache. The recoil seemed to travel through the world itself. Then, after the echo, came the smaller sounds, shouted range calls, the click of rifle bolts, the wet suck of boots in mud as a sortie party went down ladders into the trench mouth, vanishing into the dark as if swallowed. The registrar tasted grit and oil on his tongue and realized his hands were trembling, not from fear alone, but from the absurdity that a scholar's fingers, meant for paper, were now wrapped around a steel railing while hell tried yet again to force its way into the lives of people who had never asked for apocalypse. He did not go with the sortie. Registrars were too valuable to waste. Instead, he did what the house had trained him to do. He watched, remembered, and refused to let the truth dissolve into rumor. He watched the Janissaries return at dawn, their armor spattered with mud that had dried in pale crusts, their breath smoking through mask filters, their posture unchanged even when a man limped, even when another carried a wounded comrade whose blood ran dark and slow in the cold. He watched an alchemist kneel by a shattered parapet stone, collecting flecks of strange residue left by an infernal munition as carefully as if gathering saffron. He watched the wall's priests, imams whose voices had gone rough with years, walk the line with lanterns shielded behind their palms, murmuring blessings that sounded like wind through reeds, and he saw the way even the hardest soldiers leaned, just slightly, toward that sound. This was the Iron Sultanate as it truly existed in the Great War, not a caricature of saintly virtue, not a parade of exotic brutality, but a civilization shaped like a fortress, holding back a tide that never tires, using every tool it can forge, steel, faith, knowledge, discipline, to keep one more dawn from becoming humanity's last. And when the registrar finally returned to the House of Wisdom, days later, he did not write a triumphant chronicle. He wrote a quiet one. He wrote of iron warmed by sun and then chilled by night, of the smell of oil on gunmetal, of the taste of dust after a bombardment, of how the wall's shadow could feel like safety and like a reminder of what lay beyond. He wrote of the Sultanate's old miracle, the manifestation of Du al-Qarnayn's barrier, and of the newer miracles made by human hands in workshops where alchemists and armorers labored until their fingertips split. He wrote of the Janissaries raised for war because peace was not available, and of the Azeb who learned to. See in darkness because darkness was where the enemy preferred to breathe. He wrote, too, of the unendingness of it all, the gate still open, the trenches still hungry, the year still 1914 in the sense that matters, the sense that the war has not moved on, because the world cannot move on until the breach is closed or the last faithful soldier stops fighting. The Iron Sultanate endures not because it believes itself invincible, but because it has learned the only lesson the Great War teaches without mercy, that survival is a practice repeated daily with discipline hard enough to outlast despair. You have stood the watch with him now, felt the iron under your hands and the long breath of the wall in the dark. And if this chronicle found a place to rest in your thought after a hard day, then you have my thanks. If you would hear more voices from the trenches and the histories they carry, I invite you to like this recording, to subscribe, and to remain with us on the line. And if the world of Trench Crusade has taken hold of you, as it has so many of us, seek out the official game itself, forged with rare care and conviction by the creators at Factory Fortress, whose vision, labor, and respect for the weight of history have given this war its soul. This setting exists because they dared to build something uncompromising, something that does not flinch, and it deserves to be seen in its full form on the tabletop as much as it is heard here. Until we meet again, keep your powder dry, your faith steadier still, and remember this: iron does not endure because it is unyielding, but because it is reforged again and again until the wall still stands.